Terrific. Thanks so much, Elta. So I am going to go through the CESTI's straw framework elements, and what I alluded to yesterday was the composite heat map. And then we're going to have a couple of reactors to sort of give us their views on what CESTI has come to date. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm trusting that everyone can see this. I have zoomed it to a point where I hope that folks can read this all right. But again, I'll be walking through this. So CESTI distilled about 2 years of work into these straw framework elements that I'm about to walk through and that I went through very, very briefly yesterday. Importantly, these straw framework elements are not intended to render a judgment about the inherent value or benefit of a technology, but rather to collect the information necessary to enable a more iterative and anticipatory approach to adjusting a governance ecosystem than is typically the case today, and to better align the impacts of a technology with guiding principles focused on societal benefit. So this introduction is just the argument that you heard Gary Marchant make yesterday, and a bit about the background that I went through yesterday as well. You also heard me mention yesterday that CESTI's straw framework and our work generally has taken into account the perspectives of 3 key constituencies: individual users in society who use the technology, often shape it in their use, and live in the world shaped by it; the drivers of technology, who play a central role in design and development; and the formal governance actors, including policymakers, regulators, etc. So with that preamble, into the framework elements. First part of the process, of course, is identifying the technology that you're going to consider through this set of elements. And technologies, we imagine, can enter a framework through a variety of pathways, including sort of nomination from scientists or technologists or members of the public. And a technology could be put forward at a variety of points in the technology life cycle, but the framework, we hope, will be sort of initially applied further upstream in tech development than current mechanisms for governance of emerging technologies traditionally have been. Again, sort of in the spirit of what Jenny was just talking about, moving our attention further upstream. I also spoke yesterday about the guiding principles and values that CESTI came to, and this is sort of the foundational part of the foundational core of the straw framework elements. And you just heard George reiterate justice, autonomy, fairness, collective good, and individual good. We also highlight in this foundational core equity, diversity, and inclusion. And while equity is included among the guiding principles and values, EDI has sort of a particular meaning and direct applicability to the governance of emerging technologies, such that CESTI felt it was important to emphasize and call out individually as well. We highlight 2 informational elements: scientific assessment and public engagement and democratic deliberation. Of course, a thorough assessment of the science and technology underlying new innovation is critically important. And we recognize, of course, that multiple technologies might be built on the same underlying science. And we emphasize that iteration across the entire life cycle of development of an emerging technology is important as scientific understanding deepens and evolves. So sort of keeping pace with that evolution and allowing that evolution to inform assessments. We talked a lot about public engagement yesterday, and CESTI does not specify any particular model, either of the models that we heard yesterday or any other, but what we say is that it is critical that there is an inclusive, transparent process built into the system to educate the public on the science, learn about their preferences and values, and be responsive to the prevailing concerns and questions about emerging technologies and their governance. From the informational elements, we move to assessment. There are a series of elements in this category, starting with sectoral analysis and stakeholder identification, which is really sort of the core of what our case studies were. And the sectoral analysis should consider the impact of technology within and across a range of relevant sectors, identify relevant stakeholders, and identify existing and potential governance mechanisms that are relevant both within and across sectors. The second assessment component is foresight, or what we called visioning in the development of our case studies. And the goal of this anticipatory exercise is that we create a plausible future scenario that is scientifically grounded with respect to how it's being deployed, the use case that's being imagined, regulatory requirements, and public adoption. Risk-benefit analysis, and here CESTI was thinking pretty expansively about risks and benefits, not just, for example, physical risks as are typically taken into account in many regulatory processes, but broader individual impacts, including but not limited to impacts related to mental health, information security, economic harms, and diffusion of benefit, including which stakeholders are better off, worse off, or untouched by the technology. You've heard many people talk about incentives over the last day and change. And CESTI indeed spent a lot of time thinking hard about incentives. And we're talking about incentives and disincentives at various levels, individual, organizational, sectoral, and how those incentives shape innovation and the adoption and evolution of emerging technologies. We felt it's important not only to identify incentives that can shape tech development in alignment with the guiding principles, but also the disincentives that work against that the kind of responsible innovation that a framework would be designed to foster. The composite heat map I will come back to in a minute because I'm going to show you sort of a mock-up of this heat map and talk through it. But the idea here is that we need a way of distilling some of this information about a technology and its alignment with the guiding ethical principles as a tool for assessing the current state of a technology and its impact. And again, I will circle back to this in a minute, but the idea is that the performance across these domains would serve as concrete indicators or markers of alignment with the guiding principles and values to help us do that translation of principles and values into policy choices. For any of this to happen, we need more coordinated governance. And the two key sort of foci of CESTI have been taking a cross-sectoral lens to emerging technologies, and then this focus on translating ethical principles into governance choices. And to have that cross-sectoral lens, you also need coordinated governance. And there are a number of different mechanisms that might facilitate coordinated governance, including a body that that is cross-sectoral and facilitates coordinated governance. This could be a standing or ad hoc committee or a government entity comprised of multi-sectoral and multi-domain experts. But that's not, of course, the only way that a framework of this sort could be implemented. Importantly, when you're talking about decisions based on ethical principles, there will inevitably be tensions and conflicts between satisfying two principles that are in tension in the context of the deployment of a particular technology. And it'll be critical for there to be a capacity to mobilize a clearly articulated, transparent, inclusive, situationally appropriate process for resolving such tensions and conflicts, and for there to be independent review of such adjudication. And then we'll also need ongoing mechanisms for iterative evaluation and course correction, right? As George said, the principles won't change, but the circumstances around this and the technology is certainly going to change. And there'll need to be a process for iterative evaluation and course correction, not only for the review of technologies, but also for the evaluation of the framework that's produced to ensure that the framework itself remains fit to purpose and effective. So now I'm going to circle back to the composite heat map that I mentioned before. And this is very small at the start, but I promise I will zoom in just a second. So again, the heat map is, as we've called it, is just one governance tool that CESTI felt can help facilitate a shared understanding of the impact of a technology and its current governance ecosystem with regard to societal benefit. It's meant to provide a visual representation of the results of a process that evaluates the alignment of a technology's impact, again, under current governance, with the guiding ethical principles. And performance is assessed based on a set of concrete indicators, or as I said earlier, markers of alignment with the articulated guiding principles and values. So what you're seeing here along the left-hand side, and again, I will zoom in just a second. I just want to give you sort of the overarching roadmap. The 5 principles that you've heard repeatedly along the left-hand side with a series of questions that are these sort of markers of alignment that we're talking about. Up in the left-hand side is the technology that we're looking at and its stage in development. And then along the top here, we have sector of deployment, so academia, healthcare, private sector, the sectors that I've shown you before on sort of that pinwheel diagram, and then a series of activities or decision processes that we're focusing on. And I'll come to the color coding in a minute. So pardon me while I zoom way in so that this is legible. So here we have, as I mentioned, this is the technology in the visioning component to the regenerative medicine case study, which was case study 3, early in the life cycle. As I said, on the left-hand side are the principles, the overarching principles and values, and then a set of questions that reference those principles. So for example, how equitable is individual access to benefits? For example, do marginalized groups have the same access as more privileged groups? How equitable is distribution of burdens across individuals? What about impact on existing health disparities? Impact on existing economic disparities? Under collective good, how equitable is group access to benefits? What is the environmental impact of the research or technology? And the idea is that you would then ask these questions. These are just example questions. So you would ask a set of questions across these sectors and activities or decision processes. So for example, in academia, if you're determining what your clinical research disease targets are going to be, you can ask these series of questions, right? Is the disease that you're considering targeting, how equitable is the distribution of that disease across individuals and groups, for example? What will the impact of that disease choice be for justice? In the context of healthcare, maybe early in the development, insurance coverage isn't as big of a deal as it will be in later development, but the availability of clinical trial sites and how geographically distributed that is would be relevant. Government, privacy, what are the privacy protections of the data related to this? So what we have done is, the next slide I'm going to show you is one of these heat maps filled in with color coding that indicates whether the risk is low in green up through high risk in red, and whether the benefit, anticipated benefit, is high, which is a darker blue, or low, which is a lighter blue. This is just a hypothetical. This is just an example to give you an idea of how this might work. I'm going to zoom back out so that you can see the colors. So for example, for this early stage technology, insurance coverage, which I mentioned earlier, maybe not as big of an issue. That's very low risk right now because it doesn't come into play so much. But here we have some red, right? That is intended to begin to focus our attention. What are the hot spots? What are the places where this technology under current governance is raising concerns relevant to our guiding principles? And how can we now focus our attention on the governance of those spaces and maybe make some adjustments to try to better align that particular activity or decision process with our guiding ethical principles? And again, just an example of this filled out, this same technology later in development, maybe the pattern changes quite a bit. Insurance coverage does begin to be an issue. The availability of trial sites becomes much more concerning at that stage of the technology. The business model that's being deployed for this technology appears to be raising some concerns here as well. So again, this is not intended to make decisions, but rather to distill some of the assessments that have been done and focus the attention of decision makers on those parts of the process, those areas of deployment that seem to be out of alignment with the guiding ethical principles, so that governance decisions can be made that hopefully bring the impact of that technology more into alignment with the ethical principles and values that we've articulated. And again, this is one possible tool, and there are lots of questions that we still have about it that the consensus study will have to take on. For example, who's completing the heat map and what are their interests? Will the results of the heat map be made available outside of the decision-making group? And if so, who will have access to those data, to that assessment? What if the answer to a particular question in one of those little boxes includes both risk and benefit? How do you think about that? How do you represent that? How do you manage the governance decisions there? What are the triggers for reassessment? You've heard iterative process a number of times, right? Do we redo the heat map when a technology moves from one stage in the technology lifecycle to another? Is reassessment triggered when a new technology comes in that radically shifts or expands the capacities of the main technology that we're looking at? Like, how do we think about when we reassess? And then what are the incentives for participation, right? How do we encourage people and companies, drivers and policymakers to engage not only with this composite heat map, but with the framework overall? And those will be questions that the consensus study has to take on. Victor, did you want to ask a question before we transition?
I wanted you to maybe illustrate that heat map a little bit more in terms of the dynamic nature and the multi-tier approach. You gave an example of early stage, and you can certainly move along the heat map to show the later stage, and that is multi-tiered. I just thought you may want to illustrate that.
Yeah, so I showed the shifting in the colors from an early stage to a later stage of that technology. And it's absolutely the case that there are, that's an Excel spreadsheet. It is a two-dimensional object. There are other ways that you could represent a heat map-like model that is more tiered and allows you to drill down to more refined questions over time. So maybe the high level question is about, distribution of risks and benefits. And then within a particular activity or decision process, there's a more specified version of that question, sort of getting to those levels that David was talking about earlier and getting down to more concrete questions. But that would be very specific to that technology in that use case, right? So again, questions that the consensus study is going to, if they pick up the heat map, they're going to have to decide exactly how this gets deployed, by whom, and to what level of detail are they going to take it. All right. So we now are going to hear from two reactors. First, we'll hear from Cathy Novelli, who is a senior advisor at Shearwater Global, a strategic consulting firm. She also serves as president of Listening for America and is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and importantly, a member of CESTI. Then we'll hear from Kenneth Oye, who's a professor of political science and Data Systems and Society, and the director of the program on emerging technologies at MIT. Cathy, please.
Thanks so much, Deborah. And I just want to thank Victor and everybody who worked on this project. It was an amazing project to be involved with. And I think, the heat map and the straw framework, that represents the distillation of a ton of work. And I think one of the strengths of it is that it was derived from practical case studies. And so to me, I fully agree with what George said, that what needs to be produced is something that people can use and not just an academic construct. And I think what's really interesting to me about the heat map is that, as you said, Deborah, it doesn't make judgments about what you're going to do about things. It says, here's the issues. I think one of the refinements that the consensus study is going to have to look at is right now you have, equal boxes for every single thing. And is everything always going to be weighted exactly the same? And I think that's part of the two-dimensional versus three-dimensional, approach to all of this. I also think that you can envision understanding the reality that everything is really cross-border in these days, that you're really not going to be able to contain things completely to one country or territory. To take up on what David Wenkoff said earlier, I think you could envision actually different groups filling out the heat map differently in different countries. And I think that's what's also the beauty of it, because it doesn't judge, it is flexible enough to allow different societies to weight things differently and to decide, because insurance, for example, may not even matter if you're in Sweden or someplace that has, everybody having access to medicine. So, I mean, I think that is the beauty of the way that it's constructed. And I think the values that it is constructed on are very universal. And that, I think, is something that can absolutely go beyond borders. To me, part of the challenge of all of this, really coming from a more tech background from my years at Apple, is that I think that, there are going to be some technologies that are purely in the medical field where all of that just makes all sense. I think the time when it's going to really be challenging are maybe they're edge cases, maybe they're not, where there's technology developing and it's doing lots of things. And medical applications are one of them, but not all of them. And so how you kind of look at that from a governance perspective, I think is going to be extremely challenging. And I think it is the wave of the future. And it's something that the consensus study is going to have to think about, because, using the word governance or constitution or any of these kind of words, I think in a tech situation where innovation is really valued, and not having interference in innovation at an early stage so you can kind of let it run, it's very counterintuitive to think about governing at that point. And maybe not on things that are purely medical, but I think on things where there's cross-cutting application, there's going to be a ton of resistance to that. And I think there's also resistance to the idea that government regulators know better about innovation and where it's going to head than others. And so I think those are some huge questions that the consensus study is going to have to wrestle with. But overall, I think it's an amazing start to an incredibly, incredibly complicated issue.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Kenneth Oye.
Okay. First, is the sound working?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. I know we guys at MIT are masters of technology, and I always have more trouble with Zoom. First, Deborah, congratulations on an extraordinary amount of work on a very, very difficult subject. What I want to do is push back just a little bit, following Jenny's advice to be impolite. Okay. But what I want to do is look to past examples of people trying to do what we're doing and do a little bit of an evaluation. And that's the first set of points I want to make, looking at the record, if you will. Then looking at what we do about it. And then going into some examples, including some that you've spoken to. So first, in terms of the ability of people to do heat mapping, to do broad, sweeping technology assessments at early, middle, and late stages, as you've done, the closest example I could come up with was the European Union's Emerging Science and Technology Priorities and Public Research Policy. It was a study that they did back in 2006. They picked a whole bunch of different technology areas. They tried to talk about, if you will, characterizing the status of the technologies and some of their effects. And the beauty of it was, because it was in 2006, and they were also looking ahead a little bit, you could see, gee, what were they saying for 2015, 2020, 2025, and compare it with what was going on. To make a long story short, it was awful. It wasn't just off a little bit, it was horrendous. What was surprising was actually that they even got their characterization of what was going on at the time wrong, much less the predictions. The caution here is, and maybe we can do it better, okay, just to be clear, but the way they did it, because it was the European Union, they had to have input from many, many different countries. The expert panels were quite diverse as to nationality. And to put it politely, it was complete gibberish. I'll send the information to the Academy for consideration. Now, being arrogant people at MIT, and no one can take a backseat to MIT for arrogance, we thought we can do better than that. So when we created the program on emerging technologies, the folks that I was conspiring with said the first thing we need to do is to look at characterizations of emerging technologies, look at the predictions made as they were coming in and see what happened. To be clear about this, the people that were involved in setting up this project, I don't know if any of you know Lawrence McCrae, Larry McCrae. And Larry was at that time the head of the policy division at the National Research Council, had just moved to MIT as his wife took over a position at Harvard Medical School. Rose Smith, Merritt Rose Smith, an historian of technology, Dan Hastings and David Newman as engineers with extensive experience in government as well. Make a long story short, we grabbed our best graduate students and forced them to look at past examples of emerging technologies, some medical, mostly not. And the question that we asked was pretty straightforward. What predictions were being made at the time that the technologies were coming in, and what happened? And I gotta tell you, it's embarrassing. Okay, I mean, the predictions were not just off a little bit, they were way off. In every instance, people would offer strong statements on taking existing activities or applications and fulfilling them in a different way with a new technology. That was the standard game that people played. Existing purpose, new tech. And if you couldn't come up with a plausible story on that, the funding didn't materialize. We were biased toward cases that happened, so we found lots of cases where people were telling those stories. And what typically happened was that those boxes were not the interesting boxes. Okay, it was applications that hadn't been imagined by actors that didn't exist or may have taken on very different forms. And after doing this for the laser, for GPS, for the automobile, for a bunch of things, we held our heads in pain and said, we're not going to be able to probably even improve on the bad European Union studies. Our ability to forecast, to predict, to tell plausible stories is going to be somewhat limited. And what do we do about it? So this is where I kind of turn to George. And, I asked a question of George in that first session saying, hey, how did you figure out not what was going on in stem cells, but the fact that you changed dramatically as you were going over the years, that the evaluations, the committees, the governance issues evolved, and you didn't resist them. You were reaching out and upgrading, updating, and informing. That explicit and deliberate adaptation, identifying areas of uncertainty, trying to address them, is something to be applauded, and it may be the best that we can do. Which takes us to a question of incentives. So, Deborah, I love the fact that you were talking about incentives quite seriously here. And in addition to talking about incentives to be good people and to be fair, the points that we kind of began with, there's also the question of incentives that parties may have to identify areas of uncertainty, areas where there are significant gaps in knowledge, and to push hard for targeted research to fill in policy relevant gaps in knowledge. And here, policy relevance is a very vague term. We understand that. But it would be for information on distributional consequences, for information that we need to inform our deliberations on justice, for all the points that actually you were raising in your excellent presentation. But the fact that we often don't know, we know what we care about to some degree, but we don't know what the effects will be, and we need to be updating constantly. Who has an interest in funding, supporting, and conducting research on that stuff? So you use the expression private and collective goods. That was part of your basic framework. But part of the conception of collective goods, I think, should also include filling gaps in knowledge to inform deliberation. And the sad thing is that the parties with an interest in having that kind of work done are actually a little harder to identify than I'd like. You take academics, and academics typically get rewarded most for doing the scientific and technical work that leads to the commercial applications or the medical and therapeutic benefits, and a little bit less to research on second and third order consequences that may create problems. You take firms, and firms are often sitting there saying, don't ask, don't tell, wait a minute, why do you want to be looking into that? That's going to create problems. I'm not suggesting that every RCT and every post-marketing observational study is rigged, just some of them. And at the same time, firms, sponsors typically don't want to find the bad news, unless if they believe they're going to get sued if they don't find it out. If we even turn to regulators, the interest of regulators in funding research to inform deliberation is less intense than I thought, less clear than I thought. Lives are easier, frankly, if you make a decision and don't keep changing it all the time. So a final set of notes, and I don't want to go on too long. Let's talk examples, okay? So picking some examples from the space that you were working in, thinking also about George's list. We could be talking xenotransplantation. We could be talking gene drives and attacking vector-borne diseases. We could even be talking the creation of pharmaceuticals, opiate synthesis in yeast instead of in poppy. Many, many different weird applications of emerging technologies. And the first point is that the applications often cannot be anticipated. That was kind of the early point. But how do you govern applications like these? And the answer I'd suggest is, I don't want to be totally, it's all uncertainty, you can't do anything. The principles to emphasize and the stakeholders to identify will vary a heck of a lot by application. That's obvious. But some of it comes down to basics. If we go back to Jenny's talk, Jenny was quite properly pointing out that individualistic liberalism is not the only approach to handling these problems. But if you're talking about informed consent and patients as stakeholders with exotic treatments, then it's not a bad place to begin and to emphasize. So if you're talking, for example, xenotransplantation and the use of pig liver or pig kidney, hopefully stripped of PERVs, porcine embedded retroviruses, and with adjustments to mitigate immune response. From a patient point of view, the old-fashioned informed consent framework is a good place to start. They are stakeholders. But what makes that space more complicated from our perspective is that it's more than an informed consent issue. There's the possibility that if you don't get them all, some of the retroviruses may make that cross-species jump that we don't like very much, with implications for pandemics, if you will, external costs that go well beyond the individual patient. And that's a wholly different set of issues that require a wholly different regulatory response with quite different sources of uncertainty. The point is pretty straightforward, right? We talk about areas of concern, we talk about stakeholders, but informing our definition of who the stakeholders are and how the risk should be governed will vary dramatically by area of application. And if you will, that meta discussion on how to fund the research to inform the deliberations, how those meta deliberations should take place, is something that I think is very much part of the constitutional issues that your committee, your group has been formed to address. So I'll stop there. I could go on forever on this stuff. I thought the presentations were great. It's really an exciting set of issues. And Alda will keep all you guys on your toes. But it's really a wonderful area to be working, but it's also extraordinarily difficult, and I applaud your efforts.
Thank you so very much. So we have time for almost 20 minutes for Q&A. So I'll remind, we have one question in the Q&A box already, but I remind our audience that you're welcome to put your questions in the Q&A box. I am in the position of both moderator and presenter. So I will be asking questions and reading questions. So first, I wonder, I will take a leaf from Alta's book and ask whether Ken and Cathy want to respond to each other. I certainly have things that I would like to respond to, particularly in Ken's remarks, but to have a little bit of a conversation amongst the three of us before we turn to the Q&A.
I'm happy to hold off. I kind of went on, I had that great last position that we all like in every lineup, and I went on a little bit too long, so I'll just shut up for now.
All right, Cathy, did you?
Well, one thing I would just say is when Ken was talking about how the EU's predictions are way off, and even MIT's, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's really a challenge. And I think it's a challenge. What I like about the way the heat map is it's not trying to say, and this is what's going to happen in the future. It's just saying, here is where we are at this point in time, and here's some things that we maybe need to think about, but it's not positing an entire framework for governing something that goes on. And I think that, to me, is a way of trying to address this question of not knowing what's going to happen in the future, and then being able to look again down the road and say, okay, like that was an issue before. And what's great about that is it lets you think about it then, at that time. But understanding that there's probably not one predictive thing that's going to let you govern for the future. And in fact, that may end up being something that keeps really important and helpful and good things from happening if you come in too soon and start squashing them.
Yeah, I would just add that or first emphasize what Cathy said about the snapshot, right? The heat map is meant to capture the current status of a technology at its stage of development in the particular use case under the current governance, to identify where current governance isn't sort of hitting the mark with regard to shaping the technology toward the guiding ethical principles. And I totally take your point. We're terrible at prediction. And yet, I do think that the visioning component is important, not to predict the future, but to sort of stretch our moral imaginations about where this technology might go and get us thinking about what kinds of questions might we actually want to have along the left side of that heat map? Like, what are the things that need to be on our radar? We can envision sort of a future 10 years from now that we find problematic. Why do we find it problematic? And what are the markers that we need to be keeping track of that will help us ensure that if it starts heading in that direction, we can make a course correction, right? Not wholesale, like shutting down the technology or dramatically changing everything about how it's deployed or regulated, but course correction, midstream course corrections to keep it from getting to the kind of end that we might be concerned about. And I love, Ken, your point about filling gaps in knowledge to inform deliberations, particularly around second and third order problems and the kinds of impacts that we're actually asking about in that heat map, right? Who's going to do the research to determine the answer to those questions? I think that is an excellent point, and another way we need to be thinking about the role of funders and incentives in this space. All right, I will turn to Susan Wolf's question.
If I may.
Oh, yes.
Just a comment. Ken, outstanding questions. And I think Deborah and Cathy both explained to you the intention of a heat map. It's a tool to look at a technology at a point of time and to look at what are the issues that will be required, efforts for alignment. I would say that really what's important in thinking along this is the dynamic nature, as you have emphasized, in looking at it, throughout the thing. But I think the most important thing this is still an experiment. I don't think any one of us expect, even this were the recommendation, that one can simply apply it the next day. I think our intention would be that when the study is completed, if there were to go for a series of recommendations similar to this or some other form, we'll get people back together again to apply it, to learn from it, before we have wide-scale adoption. I think that's the purpose. So it's still very much an experiment in progress. Thank you.
A learning journey, Victor.
Yeah.
So we now have a comment from Jay Schnitzer as well, that with apologies to Susan Wolf, I'm going to go to first because it follows directly from this conversation we've just been having about the heat map. And Jay comments that the heat map will be a tool for each technology that has multiple time points that'll be collected and can be evaluated retrospectively to look for patterns and for groups of time-dependent patterns and correlations. So you can look at, okay, now we've made these shifts. Now what does the heat map look like? And have a sort of a governance learning system over time, which I think is a great point. Thank you, Jay. Yeah, Ken.
So I also recommend, I'm not against doing the work that you're talking about at all.
You're a little bit quiet. Can you get a little bit closer to your computer?
I will. Okay,
we want to make sure we hear you.
Is this better?
Yes, thank you.
So I'm not against doing the work that you're proposing at all. I do want to recommend, though, that you build in evaluation. Build in evaluation in terms of asking yourselves the hardest questions that you can come up with to kind of test the quality and utility of what you've done. And the reason why I put it that way is that the broader the categories that you use, the more it's going to look like it's accurate, but the less useful it's going to be. Okay. And to have utility as part of your criteria. Now, right after I made a recommendation to be specific and all that, I also am going to recommend that when the committee starts meeting in real time with people actually getting together and mixing it up even more intensely, distributive justice is actually going to be the hardest thing to deal with. Justice is hard. We all have standard ways of handling a lot of the other ones. And I'm really recommending that, because John Rawls may be a little hard to get a hold of right now, that you bring in people like Susan Cousins, who's written a lot on distributive justice and technology, or Kenzie Bach. Now, you've never heard of Kenzie Bach, have you? Unless if you live in Boston. She's a Boston City Councilor. She also did a PhD at a famous university in England on distributive justice, and her mother works for Excel. So people like that in their copious spare time, I think, would be really helpful. Philosophers with their feet on the ground that know something about the areas of application, and just noting that it's not a specific task, but they're good people to have in the room.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to turn to Susan Wolf's question. Is CESTI's commitment to a starting roster of 5 principles too static? How do you reconcile this starting commitment with respect for a range of different and potentially conflicting principles that other communities have advocated? For example, Terry et al. Have articulated guiding principles for participant-centered initiatives, modeling participant ownership of biospecimens and patents as a condition of respectful research. Claw et al. Have argued for 6 principles for ethical research with Indigenous people, including quote, build tribal research capacity, and, quote, disseminate findings in a community accessible format. Wilkins et al. Have called for integrating community members into research teams and co-governance of research. Other groups are actively at work. Yes, thank you, Susan. I recently had a conversation about, you know, how do we reconcile the fair and care and other sets of principles in biospecimen and genetics research. And I do think that, well, with regard to your question about whether 5 starting principles is too static, I mean, these are broad overarching principles. There are sub-principles that we have articulated under them. So I would have to think about whether or not the other sets of principles articulated by Terry and Claw and Wilkins et al., where those would fit into the broader CESTI framework. Oh, your question just disappeared because Ken answered it, I think.
Sorry, I hadn't realized that saying yes was going to kill the question.
But Cathy or Ken, do you want to comment on Susan's question? All right.
Well, just the only thing I would say is I think you're right, Deborah, that it's not really just those 5 principles. And to me, it's that whole big page, which has a lot of things. And so I think you should go back and look at that. And it may be, again, that there's different things that go along the left side for different technologies. I mean, this whole format of doing it in this way may not be static in itself either. And I think that's something that should be kept in mind when looking at it.
Yep, absolutely. And again, the values of all stakeholders that are being interacted with, right? Jenny brought up sovereignty, which is critically important and increasingly part of the conversation in genetics and genomics and AI, which I think is a tremendous advance. Yes, Ken. And then I'm going to turn to a question from David Winikoff.
Well, in that case, all I wanted to say was the conversation that we're having has to be internationalized. It has to be internationalized because as important as we are, we're not the only place where the work's being done. And the implications of heterogeneity in approaches to addressing these issues for the location of the research is an application of theories of regulatory harmonization and that set specificity that we don't need to spell out here, but we need to worry about.
Yeah, Cathy smiled big when you said that because she's been saying that all along. So thank you for that, and I take David's point too, to keep the conversation going. So to do so, David's question is, how could or should this, David, do you mean the heat map tool, or do you mean another part of the framework?
Yeah, sorry, the heat map tool.
Okay. So how could or should this be integrated into existing models of technology assessment, for example, of GAO that we heard about yesterday from Tim Persons? And does it fill a gap in that discipline by being more explicitly ethics and governance based? Yeah, I would actually, I don't know if Tim is able to be on today, but I would love to hear what he has to say about that, right? I mean, I think we have 4 different components that we're calling components of assessment or elements of assessment, and have been, I think, thinking about technology assessment pretty expansively, and of the heat map tool as a way to distill a bunch of that work into a visualization that helps focus attention of decision makers. So I would say yes. I don't know what all of the members of CESTI would answer that question, particularly Tim Persons, who you should totally ask.
Deborah, as a matter of fact, Tim Person did show us his version of heat map in many of the cases that he showed us. So he is using those tools.
Yes, a number, and Jay Schnitzer, who spoke up earlier, is familiar with tools, with heat map like tools as well. I mean, it isn't completely novel, but I think that the way that we are suggesting it be used to assess alignment with guiding ethical principles is a sort of a useful version of this tool.
Yeah, just to add, the implicit point is that you are doing something interesting and new with respect to technology assessment, which tends not to put these sort of ethical principles as a given in assessing technology with respect, technology and the governance of those technologies with respect to those principles. So I think that's interesting, and I think it can really complement some of the tech assessment the good tech assessment that's out there.
Fantastic, and thank you. So we have 2 minutes left. Oh, I see that another question has come in from Tim Evans. So I think this will probably be our last question. Ken's suggestion on the need for investing in the information required to have the deliberative discussions around the ethical principles is critical. Does Ken have any good examples of where such investment has benefited the deliberative discourse? Is it simply a matter of finding the dollars to support the generation of information? Or are there other structural constraints like the availability of content experts on these questions?
A quick answer to that. I have a half example, and it's actually on biological engineering applications that present potential environmental hazards, as well as technical designs to try to limit environmental effects and the uncertainties over how big are the effects and how effective are the safeguards. We had a workshop with people that don't get along. We had in the same room, under Chatham House rule, Dow AgroSciences, Synthetic Genomics, and Friends of the Earth. Now, an amazing thing happened, and I explicitly asked people I could mention this. They all agreed on what we needed to know more about. They certainly differed in terms of thresholds for proceeding with work, but they agreed on what needed to be understood better. And the miracle was the NSF guy in the room said, we'll help fund that. Now, of course, the funding was not adequate to really follow up in great detail, but it was a step. It was in the right direction. EPA was sitting there holding their head saying, we don't have any money to fund the research, but we'd love to. But that would be one example. Another example would be EPA on methylmercury. And years ago, when the Faroe Islands and Seychelles studies came in and diametrically opposed results, a conference was held that identified the sources of uncertainty, and another research design emerged to address policy relevant areas of contention. And that study provided a basis for rulemaking on mercury emissions. So that would be an example that kind of worked.
Terrific. Thank you so very much. And thank you to you both for providing your reflections on the work that CESTI has done to date and the development of the framework elements and the heat map as well. And thank you to the audience for participating and providing your questions. So now we're going to go into a 10-minute break. I think we are to come back at 3:35 for a discussion on where do we go from here.